There was a show in the early 2000s called Trading Spaces. Two teams, 2 days, $1,000. That was the tagline of this show. Yes, it looks a little cheesy. It was 20 years old. But the neighbors, the idea is that neighbors would have a chance to redesign a room in their other neighbor's house, in each other's house. What could go wrong? What could go wrong? And each of these neighbors had about $1,000 with a professional designer to completely renovate a room in their neighbor's house. So there's this very nice couple, and they just wanted their basement done. And they only had one non-negotiable: don't renovate or change the basement or the fireplace. You can do anything else, just don't touch the fireplace. So at the end of the show, the neighbors did all the work, spend $1,000 with the professional designer, and the host comes in, locking arms with the two homeowners, and they walk into the basement. She's like, "Okay, open your eyes." And they open their eyes, and you can look on their faces, like awkward silence for like, it seemed like 3 minutes. She's like, what do you think? Their first thing they say, "It's different." When someone says it's different, they probably don't like it, right? No, it's different. Okay. And then the host, puts their eyes to the fireplace that's completely renovated. "What do you think?" And the wife was like, "You're about to change that in a couple minutes from now." She ends up running out of the room literally in tears. Like the hope is that the redesign would actually look good, and it obviously looked terrible in their eyes. Trading Spaces was the TV show. I love TLC, like this crazy drama. Hey, we're in our second installment of our series called Self by Design, because our self is not supposed to be just found, it's supposed to be created, it's supposed to be designed. Last week we talked about the role of a custodian, someone who stewards themselves, the self space. This week I want to talk about the role of a designer. And as a designer like shapes a space, it makes it what it was originally intended to look like. The basement was originally intended to look like what they had in mind, and obviously wasn't what they intended for it to look like at all. And I think of our own self space, which I kind of describe as three different elements of the self space. Ourselves are kind of combined with our minds, which is our ability to make decisions. And maybe for you're like, it's perfectly aligned, it's perfectly designed. I make great decisions all the time. I never make a bad decision in my life. And then the second element is emotions, your ability to regulate and express your emotions. Maybe you're like, I've never had an unchecked emotion. I've never let anger get the best of me. Not me. Or maybe the third element of the self space is the body, the ability to provide nourishment for the body in a healthy way. And you're like, my body, it kind of looks like Arnold Schwarzenegger. So I don't. This one you can pass. Like, I am good to go. If you said all three of these are an amazing spot, please come up and talk to me after. I'd love to know your secrets. That would be great. But for most of us, looking at the elements of the self space, it's not designed how we want it to be designed. You look at mentally, and you have thoughts that just keep you up at night. Maybe your decision making is just not there. What about emotions? Do you ever have anger? I guess the best of you, do you ever not know what to do with an emotion? Do you throw emotions under the rug? Or maybe the body. Do you have a negative view of yourself, a body image? Do you not know how to nourish your body with the right food, with the right exercise? What do we do when our self is just not designed how we want it to be? It's like the woman who goes in, and we know what the original design should look like. It should look amazing. And we look at our mental, our physical, and our emotional health, and it's completely not what we expected. Maybe just like the wife, you're overwhelmed. You look at the self space, how you manage your mental health, your physical health, your emotional health. Not only you're overwhelmed, but you might be tempted to just split, to forget it all, and to say it can just happen by default. It's too hard to design this in a way that's healthy. But what we know is that God designed our self to be healthy. He literally wants this for you. And the cool thing is, you want this for yourself. So, how do we align our self space with its original intention, which is a healthy life, mind, body, and emotions? A healthy life. This is the goal of what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be looking at a man named Mordecai in the Bible. Mordecai was a designer. He actually designed his self space with 3 key practices. So, if you're looking to get healthy mentally, emotionally, or physically, these 3 practices that Mordecai exhibited will be an amazing start to your journey towards a healthy life. Sound good? All right, well, let's dive in. We're in the book of Esther, 10 chapters. Read it if you can on your own. It'll take maybe 20 minutes. It's a great, small, simple read. And we can't talk about Esther without talking about Mordecai. Mordecai was the uncle, cousin, father. We don't know exactly sure what his role was, but we definitely know he was the father figure to Esther. He kind of raised this woman. And what we know about Mordecai is he was a official. Thanks. Yeah, go ahead. Just kidding. He was an official in the government of Persia. Persia is one of the most powerful governments and powers in the world at the time. And what we know about Mordecai is that he was steadily rising up the ranks. He had significant influence. And things were looking good for Mordecai, except for one issue. The culture of Persia was a little bit different. Typically, when a kingdom conquered another kingdom, they would say, okay, you're a snake god. Okay, that's great god, but you have to forsake the snake god and you have to take on my gods because I conquered you. That was like the idea behind the cultures back then. But the Persians were a little different. They say, okay, you love snakes, that's your god, right? The carrot god, whatever your god is, awesome. You get to keep your god as long as you say my gods are also gods. So we're just going to add your carrot god to the pantheon of gods that I have. So we call that a pluralistic society, where your truth is your truth. Everyone has their own God. By the way, we live in a pluralistic society right now. The only issue with the pluralistic society is that you just can't say that one God is more important. That's the one thing you can't say. Mordecai's a Jewish person rising to power, and he just decides to hide his faith. Have you ever maybe hid your faith because maybe it's not what the culture is looking for? Have you maybe kept it a little quiet because you know it could have negative repercussions to your reputation? This is what Mordecai did. Did you know Esther is the only book in the Bible that never mentions God? The idea is that God was hidden. Mordecai hid God. But then comes this point where he has to decide. It's a tipping point. Either am I Jewish or am I Persian? I have to choose one of them. Am I going to say, I believe this God, despite what the negative ramifications might be? Or am I going to choose this culture and say everything's good, all gods are gods? And this is what happens. We'll read it together. This is Esther 3:2-4. It says, all the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to a man named Haman, for the king had commanded his concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. The royal officials at the king's gate asked, why do you disobey the king's command day after day? They spoke to him, but he refused to comply. Therefore, they told Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated, for he had told them he was a Jew. I think of Mordecai. He stood for his faith, but I imagine his self-space, right, at this time of mentally, physically, and emotionally, and just how maybe misaligned it was. He says that he wants to follow God, but then he's taking his cues from culture when it comes to his mental health, his physical health, his emotional health. It's not designed the way that he wanted it to, maybe like us. But this is the first practice that we see that he does to align his space to a healthy life, a life of a Christian. You can write this down. It's simplicity. On your little notepad, there's a couple fill-ins. I think 6 words you have to fill out, or 8 words. Here's the first one. Clear the clutter. Simplicity is to make space for the Creator's love. This is the first practice that he does to design it with its original intention of a healthy life. In a lot of ways, Mordecai is kind of the dream. He is powerful. He had influence. He's probably rolling in wealth. I mean, we're talking about Persia here, one of the most wealthiest powers of all time. And yet he chose a different path. He could have followed power. He could have followed money. He could have followed fame. But he decided, I'm going to simplify my desires and go after just one, and that is the Lord. I love this quote by G.K. Chesterton. He says, there are only two ways to get enough. Hey, that was like perfect timing. I love it. One is to continue to accumulate more and more. And the other is, what's the next two words? The other is to desire less. To desire less. He said, I'm going to desire God. I'm going to want, and I'm hoping everything else will fall into place. That was his hope, I'm sure. Reggie, who's a person that attends our church, he actually been attending our church since we began, which is really cool, which is not too long. We've been alive for 5 months, but he's been here for almost a year, which is great, like since the summer, actually, even before we launched. And his life has dramatically changed being in this community of Create Church over the past year or so. So I texted him because I think he exemplifies this value of simplicity so well. And he sent me back a couple of paragraphs. Can I read it to you guys, what he said? Okay, so this is how his life has changed because of this value of simplicity in his own life. He says, my life before embracing Jesus was a whirlwind of chaos, confusion. I dealt with people who never accepted me, undervalued me, showed me little respect. I faced persecution because I was trying to conform to everyone's expectation at my job, within my family, my friends. But following Jesus helped me understand the reason behind the mistreatment I endured. I realized that I'd been trying to please people who would never be satisfied with me, and I made a sacrifice, letting go of dating, of partnership, of friendship, of trying to fit in. Instead, I focused on Jesus. And I hoped that I would seek first the kingdom of God and everything else would fall into place, which is a verse in the Bible. That's what he hoped for. He says, I've been on this journey for a couple years now, and I actually got baptized because I felt it was the right time. I'm older. I have a deep understanding of what it means to pick up my cross and follow Jesus. Baptism for me was a way to show commitment to my walk, to show up more, to try to connect more with other believers and find my tribe. I feel a sense of healing, happiness, and inner peace. I think, and I've been with Reggie on his journey of just trying to like figure out the desires of his heart and his ability to say, I'm gonna focus on God and hope that everything else falls into place. That's an act of faith. By the way, Mordecai did the same thing, right? He's probably going to die because he didn't kneel down before this man. It's an act of faith to say, I'm going to follow God, and I'm hoping that other things to fall into place. And it was one of the joys of Create Church so far in my life was to be able to baptize Reggie. And we baptized 14 people. We 6 ethnicities, 4 generations. But Reggie, baptizing him and seeing him make this commitment of simplicity in his life and seeing him follow through has been awesome. So, shameless plug, we do have baptisms next week. So if you're like, hey, oh my gosh, I want to be like Reggie. I want to simplify my life. I want to make this commitment for me, not because I want to be like Reggie. Oh, thank you. Slowly slipping. Just like our faith can slip. That's good. That was good. If you want to make that commitment, we'd love for you to do that. You can do that on your card or come up and talk to us at Create Corner. But we see that Mordecai, the first practice that he does to align his self, mental, physical, and emotional, is to simplify his life, to simplify his desires, all the competing priorities, power, money, fame, influence. He said, I'm going to go after God at the risk of his life. Now, that's the first one. Haman is a perfect definition of what it looks like to follow something that's not God. He followed power. That was his goal, his one ambition. And if you followed anything that's finite, power, money, fame, influence, sex, beauty, any of these things that's finite, what you'll notice is you have to start taking the values on of what it takes for that ultimate goal. With power, you have to be willing to kind of cut corners ethically. With power, you have to be willing to look at people as just objects to get to power. So if your goal is anything but God, you'll start noticing you'll be taking on these negative attributes that will dramatically affect your mental, physical, and emotional health. Haman was a pure version of what it looks like to go to the 9th degree, because what he did, he says, I want power. Mordecai, who's a Jew, is not going to bow down to me. So in order to hurt Mordecai, I'm going to kill him. But I'm going to kill all of the Jews. This way, I will have true power. Imagine getting to a point in where your sole focus is anything that's finite, like how you could become that type of, he became that evil person, like a Hitler. And that's what he did. He mass exterminated, that was his goal, all of the Jews at the time. He went to the king, convinced the king somehow, the king's name in another translation is headache. He wasn't a great king. He was just a headache. He said yes to him, and go ahead. He signed a decree to mass exterminate all the Jews, and this is what Esther 3:13 it says. It says, dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young, old, women, children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. What did Mordecai do? This will lead to the second practice in the self-space. What we see Mordecai do is he literally goes out into the courtyard, rips off his clothes, and he's crying out to God. He's crying, he's mourning, he's angry, and it's interesting. You're like, I would never do that. But this brings us to our second practice. You can write this down. Nourishment. To establish rhythms that nourish the body as a sacred home. You're wondering, what's the correlation? I was in my own group on Wednesday night, and we're going through the mental, emotional, and physical sides of the self-space and which one we struggle with the most. And I was like, I don't know. I feel like I might struggle with the emotional one. What I often like to do is put my emotions under the rug. But doing that too often will lead you to tripping over the rug by giving in to a temptation, by letting a trigger create a person in you that you don't want to be. We see Haman, or we see Mordecai, he had a practice, which was to release. He let it all go. Let the emotions come, and he released them. But not only this, he also had other practices like fasting, we'll see in the Bible. In other words, he had rhythms that he had to establish. If he was going to follow God with everything he had to establish rhythms mentally, physically, and emotionally to nourish himself so that he could withstand all of the triggers of the day, all the things that would come at him, like the worst thing, a decree of mass genocide. So he had ways to nourish his body. Do you have ways that nourish yourself, rhythms, physically? Do you have ways that you can express your emotions? Journaling, walking with your spouse, walking with a friend, talking through things? What about mentally? Ability to make decisions. Do you have free space? Maybe an off day where you actually don't think about work, a way to actually not think about it. You can make better decisions. What are ways that you nourish yourself in those three spaces? It's funny. I was my first therapy appointment ever, like 10 years ago. And I'm sitting with my therapist, and she's like, where do you hold your stress? My job, my relationships. She's like, no, like where physically? Oh. I was like, oh, I guess my shoulders. Where do you hold your stress? Maybe it's your forehead. People are like, it's all the time. Trying to figure out life. For me, it's here. I'm like trying to figure it all out. And it's just so funny how our self kind of carry the weight of us mentally, emotionally, physically. And it was sad because I realized I was kind of looking at myself more like a car. I have to get from A to B, and it's just the thing that I have to deal with to get there, right? Like, I'll maintain it when it's broken down. It's fine. Like we don't look at ourselves as a home. We look at ourselves like a car. It's like our bodies, ourself keeps the score. Like if we eat terrible food versus great food, like yeah, like Taco Bell, the toilet keeps the score in that circumstance. How do you nourish your body so it's not just a car, but it's a home? You're living in this self for a long time, actually, for as long as you're alive. This is your home. Like, how are you nourishing it so that you're allowed to feel alive, to be able to be healthy mentally, physically, and emotionally, just like Mordecai did with expressing his emotions? Okay, so those are two practices to align ourselves with a healthy life, mentally, physically, and emotionally. I want to get to the last one. And, Mordecai wasn't this hero as much. He was at this moment, but most of his life, he spent it unhealthy, mentally, physically, and emotionally. That's what he spent most of his life. I imagine at this point, he might have been like 30, 40. And in a lot of ways, I mean, he rose to power, and that was his, just like him. And that was his thing that he was going after. And he made a lot of mistakes. Like Esther, basically his daughter, was forced into this twisted beauty pageant, like we talked about last week, where this king, the king that had the nickname of Headache, was trying to find this new queen of Persia. So he forced all these women to come into sex trafficking, to be witnesses to terrible things. And you'd think a father would stop that, right? But Mordecai didn't stop it. You think he would go like all Liam Neeson, right? And like she was literally taken, and you think he'd be like, "I will find you and I will kill you." No, he just let Esther go. And I'm wondering if it was because of power. If I try to step in here, if I try to, say something, maybe I'm going to lose my sense of power, right? So he was stuck in these ways for decades and decades, and then of course he finally said, "No, I'm not going to be stuck by power. I'm going to follow God, and I'm going to let everything else fall into place if it does." He didn't kneel down, and I love this, and this is what it says in kind of a theologian talks about Esther. He says this: Mordecai's refusal to bow wasn't just a rejection to Haman; it was a rejection of the idol of power. It may have been the moment of life change for Mordecai as well, a moment where all of his work and jockeying for position, jockeying for influence, all those temptations that had led him to assimilate, to be just like every other person in his culture in Persia. But it could no longer sway him anymore. Suddenly, Mordecai realized he lived in a world that was bigger than him. It was bigger than Persia. He was caught up in the story of God. And his act of courage, of vulnerability, it has echoes throughout the story of the Bible. So what does it take? He literally went through a midlife crisis, right? A lot of us maybe have gone through a midlife crisis where you want to just buy this car. I just need to change my life. A midlife crisis of maybe even something even more dark and sad, like leaving your spouse. That happens with midlife crises. Or even worse, something to our own self. Maybe some of us have been through a quarter life crisis. You're 23. You're like, what do I do with my life? Where do I go? This was him. He went through this crisis and he chose God. He chose growth. He chose change. And this requires the third practice of a designer. You can write this down: curiosity. In order to change, in order to grow, we pursue growth with a humility and a hunger to discover. I got a new brother. He walked through my front door, and he was 3 years old, and we adopted him from Kazakhstan, which is right below Russia. Didn't speak any English, and I've always wanted to be an older brother, and I was so excited. And I was excited until he learned English, actually, because the one question that he would ask is why? Why is the sky blue? Why do we watch this TV show? Why is my brother so amazing and good looking? All of the classic things, My parents had to limit him to 3 whys a day. You only get 3, okay? But he was in this season of exploring life, discovering new things. And at some point, I feel like in our life, we kind of get to a point where we're like ashamed of not knowing something. So when someone asks if you know that TV show, you're like, yeah, of course. Oh, do you know that restaurant down the street? I know exactly where that is. Or, what's your opinion on? And then you have to come up with an opinion on the spot. We can't not know something. But if we want to change, if we want to grow, we have to remain curious. We have to be willing to say, I actually don't know. If we know everything, then we can't learn anything. By the way, being a Christian, it's literally called being born again. Talk about change. Talk about growth. Talk about a curiosity. To be born again, you have to be willing to humble yourself and say, I don't know everything. Curiosity. It's a posture of humility with a hunger to discover what God has for you. The growth mindset is saying, I can change, I can grow. Mordecai was probably 40 years old, and he said, no, I can change. I'm going to grow. And this act of curiosity of saying, God, what do you have for me right now? And God had for him to not kneel down, to risk his life, and he did that. What if we held on to that curiosity that we had as children? What if we were okay? Maybe we actually can change our minds about a topic. Can I even say that out loud? Maybe it's okay to ask more questions than we give answers to. A posture of curiosity. This is what Mordecai had. Okay, so those are the three. A designer shapes a space. There might be the last fill-in. A designer shapes a space. And we can see Mordecai shaped his self-space now with these three practices. It was unhealthy mentally, physically, and emotionally, torn between power and God. And yet he chose these three practices, and it allowed him to be aligned with a healthy life. You know, it's interesting. At the end of Esther, there's 10 chapters. And the last verse, the title is The Greatness of Mordecai. And it says this, Mordecai, he ranked second in command to King Xerxes. He was popular among the Jews, greatly respected by them. He worked hard for the good of his people, and he cared for the peace and the prosperity of his race. Simplicity, nourishment, curiosity were his tools to align his life mentally, physically, and emotionally. But isn't it so funny that he risked his life? He said, I'm going to follow you, God, regardless of where this is going to lead me. And yet, on the other side of surrender was his victory. Isn't that weird how that works? Oftentimes, the kingdom of God is paradoxical. It's upside down. Wait, if I surrender, if I say I don't know everything, but yet God meets us there. When I'm weak, I'm strong. That's what the Bible says. It's confusing. Mordecai literally surrendered his life to God by not kneeling to Haman, and yet he found his life in the exact same moment. I'm going to invite the band to come up. I think of Reggie also, who says he gave up this need for a partner, this need for friends, which are not bad things, you know. Money is not a bad thing. Influence is not necessarily a bad thing. But he gave it up with this sole purpose of following God, and everything else has fallen into place with Reggie. And that doesn't mean everything's perfect. But I'm going to ask if you guys can stand with me as we're going to do a great habit together. Maybe right now you're kind of in a spot like the woman in the TV show Trading Spaces, where you're looking at yourself mentally, physically, and emotionally, and you're like, I do not like what I'm seeing right now. That needs changing. I'm gonna need to fix that later. And you're feeling like, I'm overwhelmed. My mental health is not where I want it to be. The thoughts I'm having about myself, the emotions that I can't control that's hurting my relationships, the emotions that I'm not expressing are hurting myself, or my view of my own body, the way that I've not been able to nourish my body with healthy things. I feel so tired all the time. I'm tired of being tired. Your self-space is broken down. You're like that woman looking at your self-space. You're like, man, this is not designed the way it should be. Consider what it looks like today to be like Mordecai and take on these practices of simplicity, following God. Take on this practice of curiosity, being willing to say, God, what best way to this action is communion, is in the presence of the Holy Spirit. What's communion? Communion is a chance where we are reminded of why God's a better thing to follow than all the other temptations of our life today. It's because this God came down to earth. That's crazy. Died and then also rose again. I mean, that's a God I want to follow. God who can defeat death itself, the thing that we're most scared about as humans. The conqueror. I want to follow the conqueror. And he did this so that we can have freedom. So the wine, this grape juice that we'll have, it represents God's blood poured out for us on the cross. The bread represents his body broken for us. And I love it because this covers all three of these practices of a healthy self. I think of nourishment. We take these as a sign that God is our true nourishment. Above power, above food, above water, above sleep. You're my nourishment. It's a reminder to us where we get our nourishment. Simplicity, because we look at these things and we say, man, you died on the cross. I think this is the thing I want to follow all in. And also curiosity, because this allows us to take a little bit of an inventory, mentally, physically, emotionally, say, what's in the dark? What's broken? What's frail? What's hidden? And in the presence of God, we're curious. God, what is it that you want to do right now? Do you want to do a healing in my life? Do you want to enlighten me about a way that I can get out of this mental